Risk is inevitable. Manage it, don't eliminate it. Opening, the question nobody asks out loud. There is a conversation that happens quietly in almost every organization that has ever built a security program. It usually happens between a security leader and a finance committee, or between a CISO and a board, and it goes roughly like this. The security person has just finished explaining a new threat, a new vulnerability, a new category of attack that requires resources to address. And someone from the other side of the table asks the question that makes most security professionals deeply uncomfortable. If we spend this money, will we be safe? The honest answer is no, not because security professionals are incompetent, not because the money would be wasted, but because safety in an absolute sense is not available for purchase. It never was. The organization that spends $10 million on security controls is not safe. It is safer in specific ways against specific threats for a specific period of time than it was before. But the residual risk it carries after all of that spending is still real, still measurable, and still capable of materializing. The professionals who understand this do not find it demoralizing. They find it clarifying, because if total security is not the goal, then the conversation changes. The question is no longer, how do we eliminate all risk? It becomes, which risks are we willing to carry, which ones are we willing to reduce, and how do we make those choices in a way that is defensible, documented, and revisable? That shift in question is everything. It moves security from a technical function trying to satisfy an impossible standard into a business discipline that trades resources for reductions in exposure, makes those trades visible to decision makers, and builds the governance structures that keep those decisions accountable over time. This session is about what that looks like in practice. It is about the vocabulary of risk, not the jargon, but the real concepts that underpin every decision a security professional makes. It is about the tools and frameworks that make risk management operational rather than theoretical. It is about what breaks when organizations confuse compliance with security or governance with bureaucracy. And it is about what it looks like to manage risk with genuine discipline under real constraints. The foundation, understanding what risk actually contains. Risk is one of the most overused words in security. It appears in frameworks, in regulatory documents, in vendor marketing materials, and in executive presentations, often used in ways that smooth over exactly the complexity that makes it meaningful. Before anything else, we need to understand what risk actually contains and what it does not. A risk is not the same thing as a threat. A threat is any actor or force that could cause harm, an attacker attempting to breach a network, a ransomware campaign targeting healthcare organizations, a disgruntled former employee with retained access. Threats exist in the environment whether you acknowledge them or not. You do not create a threat by naming it. A vulnerability is a weakness in your systems, processes, or people that a threat could exploit. An unpatched server, a poorly configured firewall rule, an employee who has never been trained to recognize phishing, a third-party contract with no security requirements. Vulnerabilities are conditions that already exist inside your environment. Risk is the intersection of both, shaped by a third factor, which is impact. It is the likelihood that a specific threat will exploit a specific vulnerability, multiplied by the harm it would cause if it did. A critical vulnerability in a system that handles no sensitive data and is not reachable from any external network carries very different risk than the same vulnerability in an internet-facing server that stores patient records or financial transactions. Exposure is what risk becomes when it is visible to others. An unpatched server with a known CVE is a vulnerability. When that CVE appears in a shodden scan and a threat actor identifies your server as vulnerable, you have an exposure. The distinction matters because it changes the urgency of the response. Here is why this vocabulary matters so much. Every risk treatment decision you will ever make is fundamentally a decision about probability and consequence. When you invest in a control, you are betting that the reduction in probability or consequence that the control provides is worth more than what the control costs. When you accept a risk, you are making a different bet, that the cost of treating it exceeds the expected value of the harm it would cause. Neither bet is right or wrong in the abstract. Both of them are right or wrong depending on your specific context, your assets, your threat environment, and your risk appetite. Risk appetite is the concept that ties all of this together, and it is one of the most misunderstood terms in governance. Risk appetite is not a number on a spreadsheet. It is not a line on a heat map. It is an expression of how much uncertainty a specific organization is willing to absorb in pursuit of its objectives. A startup with aggressive growth targets and investors who expect disruption has a very different risk appetite than a nuclear facility or a hospital system. The security program that is right for one of them is wrong for the other. Risk appetite is not set by the security team. It is set by the organization's leadership, and the security team's job is to make it visible, to test it against reality, and to flag when the decisions being made are inconsistent with the appetite that leadership believes it has. The 4 treatments, what you actually do with a risk. Once you have identified and assessed a risk, there are 4 things you can do with it. Every security decision you will ever make is one of these 4 things, or some combination of them, and every one of them involves accepting some form of cost or loss. The first treatment is avoidance. You decide that the risk is unacceptable, and you eliminate the activity that creates it. A company handling sensitive customer data might decide not to build its own data storage infrastructure at all. Using a certified third-party processor whose contractual and regulatory obligations replace a security investment the company is not positioned to make. The risk disappears because the asset or activity that created it no longer exists in your environment. The trade-off is flexibility. There are things you could have done with that capability that you no longer can do. Avoidance is the cleanest risk treatment from a residual risk perspective, but it is the most restrictive, and it is often not available because the activity generating the risk is core to what the organization does. The second treatment is mitigation. You reduce either the likelihood that the risk will materialize, the impact it would cause if it did, or both. Multi-factor authentication mitigates credential theft by making a stolen password insufficient for access. Network segmentation mitigates lateral movement by containing what an attacker can reach after a single breach. Data encryption mitigates the impact of a storage compromise by ensuring that the stolen data is unreadable without the key. Mitigation is the most commonly chosen treatment, and it is where most of the security industry's product catalog lives. The trade-offs here are cost, complexity, and friction. Every control costs money to buy, time to deploy, expertise to operate, and maintenance effort as the environment changes. Some controls slow legitimate users down. Some of them create integration challenges. Some of them work perfectly in the reference architecture and break badly when deployed in the actual environment. Mitigation does not eliminate risk. It reduces it to a residual level that must itself be assessed. The third treatment is transfer. You shift the financial consequence of the risk to another party. Cyber insurance is the most prominent form of this. You pay a premium in exchange for a promise that if a specific category of loss materializes, the insurer will cover it up to a defined limit. The risk of the event itself does not change. You are not preventing a breach by buying insurance. You are restructuring who absorbs the financial impact of one. Transfer through contract works similarly. A cloud service agreement that includes security SLAs and indemnification clauses shift some of the liability for certain failure modes to the provider. The trade-offs here are the premium cost, the fine print about what is and is not covered, and the discipline required to actually read and understand that fine print before you need it. Insurance policies for cyber losses have specific exclusions: acts of war, fraudulent misrepresentation, losses attributable to the policyholder's own negligence. Organizations that treat cyber insurance as a substitute for security controls often discover, in the aftermath of an incident, that the policy they believed protected them was written for a narrower scope of loss than they assumed. The fourth treatment is acceptance. You look at the risk, you assess its likelihood and impact, you calculate what treatment would cost, and you determine that the treatment costs more than the expected value of the harm. You choose to carry the risk rather than treat it. This is a legitimate business decision. It is not laziness or negligence when it is made explicitly, with awareness, by the appropriate decision-maker with documentation. A small law firm with modest IT infrastructure might determine that the cost of deploying an enterprise endpoint detection and response platform exceeds what they would lose in the event of the breach scenario it addresses, and choose to carry that risk while investing in other controls that address higher probability threats. That is a defensible decision if it is documented, owned by someone accountable, and revisited when circumstances change. What is not legitimate is undocumented risk acceptance. This is one of the most common governance failures in security programs, a risk that was accepted 2 years ago by a manager who has since left, with no written record of the rationale, the scope of the acceptance, the expiry conditions, or the identity of the approver. When something goes wrong and a post-incident review uncovers this, it does not look like a business decision. It looks like negligence. The discipline of risk management requires that acceptance decisions be made explicitly, documented formally, assigned an owner, given an expiry date, and included in whatever periodic review process the organization runs to validate that its risk posture is still appropriate. This is the difference between due care and due diligence, and both concepts belong in every conversation about risk governance. Due care is the act of applying reasonable effort to address a known risk, implementing the controls, following the procedures, acting in the way a reasonable professional would act given what is known. Due diligence is the act of verifying that the care is being applied correctly, auditing the controls, testing the procedures, checking that the risk decisions made 6 months ago are still being honored. A team that deploys security controls and never verifies whether they are functioning correctly has exercised due care but not due diligence. A team that writes policies and never checks whether anyone is following them has the same problem. Both are required for a defensible security program. Building the risk register, the instrument of management. The risk register is the central instrument through which risk management becomes operational. It is the place where abstract risk concepts become concrete records that can be tracked, owned, reviewed, and updated. Understanding what a good risk register contains is not just a governance formality. It is the foundation of every audit, every board briefing, every insurance application, and every argument you will ever make about resource allocation. A well-built risk register has columns that matter: the asset or asset group affected, the threat scenario, a specific plausible description of how harm could occur, not a generic category, the vulnerability that the threat exploits, the inherent likelihood before controls rated on a consistent scale, the inherent impact before controls rated on the same scale, the existing controls that address the risk, the residual likelihood after controls. The residual impact after controls, the risk treatment decision: avoid, mitigate, transfer, or accept. The owner, a specific named person who is accountable for this risk and its treatment, not a team name. The treatment due date, the last review date, and a notes field for context that does not fit elsewhere. The most important column is the owner. A risk with no named owner is not managed. It is documented. These are different things. Ownership means that a specific person will be asked at the next review cycle whether the treatment is on track, whether new information has changed the risk level, and whether the acceptance terms are still appropriate. Without that accountability, the register becomes a compliance artifact that lives in a folder and is produced when auditors ask for it, but exercises no actual discipline over the organization's decisions. When building a risk register for a small organization for the first time, the instinct is often to identify as many risks as possible. This is the wrong starting point. The right starting point is to identify the most critical assets, the systems, data, and processes that, if compromised or lost, would cause the most harm to the organization's ability to operate and the people it serves. From those assets, identify the credible threat scenarios. From those threat scenarios, identify the vulnerabilities. Then assess. The scope of the register should be proportional to the organization's capacity to act on what it contains. A risk register with 300 items and no resources to address any of them is not a management tool. It is a wish list. The tools that enforce this discipline. Every tool deployed in a security program is a materialized risk decision. Some tools exist primarily to identify risks that have not yet been assessed. Some exist to implement the controls that mitigate risks already in the register. Some exist to monitor the environment for evidence that a risk is materializing. And some tools exist to document and communicate risk decisions across the organization. Understanding which category a tool belongs to is as important as understanding how it works. A GRC platform, governance, risk, and compliance, is the instrument through which risk management connects to the rest of the security program. It stores policies, maps controls to frameworks, tracks risk register entries, manages audit workflows, and produces the dashboards and reports that allow leadership to understand the organization's security posture without reviewing raw technical data. The benefit of a well-configured GRC platform is not just operational efficiency. It is the ability to demonstrate at any given moment that specific decisions were made deliberately by specific people, with documented rationale, and that those decisions are being tracked and reviewed. This is the evidence base that protects organizations in regulatory investigations, litigation, and insurance claims. The trade-off is the investment required to build and maintain it. GRC platforms are only as good as the data that goes into them. A GRC platform with stale risk data, outdated control mappings, and policies that no one has reviewed in 3 years provides the appearance of governance without the substance. A vulnerability scanner is the primary instrument through which the likelihood side of the risk equation is populated with real data. It tells you what is actually wrong in your environment, what software is unpatched, what configurations deviate from hardened baselines, what services are exposed that should not be. The value of a vulnerability scanner is entirely dependent on the quality of the data it receives, the breadth of its coverage, and the discipline with which the findings it generates are acted upon. A scanner that runs weekly and produces a report that sits in an email queue for 3 weeks has not improved the organization's risk posture. It has produced documentation that the risk existed. The scanner is only the first step in a process that must include triage, prioritization, remediation, and verification. A CVSS score is a useful starting point for prioritization, but it is not a risk assessment. A critical vulnerability in a system with no sensitive data, no network connectivity, and no users is lower risk than a medium vulnerability in an internet-facing application that handles payment card data. Context transforms the CVSS score into an actual risk level, and context comes from understanding the asset, the threat environment, and the mitigating factors already in place. When a vendor claims that a flagged vulnerability is unexploitable in your specific configuration, The correct response is not to immediately accept that claim or immediately reject it. The correct response is to verify it. First, understand the mechanism of the vulnerability. What preconditions does exploitation require? Then assess whether those preconditions exist in your environment. If the vendor claims the vulnerability requires authenticated access, and your implementation does not grant external users any authentication pathway, that claim is worth evaluating seriously. If they claim it requires a specific library version that you are not running, verify that the version you are actually running is confirmed not vulnerable through independent source, not just the vendor's assurance. If you cannot independently confirm the claim, the appropriate outcome is to treat the risk as real until you can, or to formally document the vendor's claim alongside your verification steps, and accept the residual risk with that documentation as support. Cyber insurance is a risk transfer tool that is often acquired without adequate understanding of what it covers. When evaluated as a component of a risk management program, the questions that matter are not just the premium and the coverage limit. What specific events are covered? What exclusions apply? What security controls does the policy require the organization to maintain as a condition of coverage? What is the notification requirement in the event of a breach? And how does that timeline interact with regulatory notification obligations? What is the insurer's definition of a covered loss? And does it include business interruption, forensic investigation costs, regulatory fines, and third-party claims? Organizations that work through these questions before acquiring a policy and that adjust their security program to satisfy the policy's requirements are using insurance as a genuine risk transfer instrument. Organizations that buy a policy without answering these questions are buying comfort rather than coverage. A SIEM, as a risk management tool, provides the monitoring capability that validates whether the residual risk levels documented in the register are still accurate. If the register says that a specific threat scenario has low residual likelihood because of the detection controls in place, the SIEM is the instrument that either confirms or refutes that assessment in real time. When the SIEM generates alerts at a rate or pattern that is inconsistent with the risk level the register documents, that is a signal that the register needs to be updated. The threat environment has changed. A control has failed. An attacker has found a technique that the existing detection rules do not cover. The SIEM is not just an operational tool. It is an ongoing validation of the assumptions embedded in the risk register. Implementation, the risk register in practice. Consider a security architect tasked with designing the security posture for a mid-sized professional services organization that has just signed a contract with a cloud-based SaaS provider for its core business processes. The organization will be sending client data to this provider. Legal has flagged the arrangement as high risk. Leadership wants the project to proceed. The security architect must produce a risk treatment plan. The first step is to be precise about what the risk actually is. Third-party data breach is too vague. The specific scenario is, the SaaS provider experiences a compromise of their cloud infrastructure, and client data stored in the shared environment is exfiltrated by the attacker. This precision matters because it determines which controls are relevant and which ones are not. Controls that prevent your own employees from exfiltrating data are not relevant to this scenario. Controls that validate the provider's security posture and limit the sensitivity of data in their environment are very relevant. From this specific scenario, the threat is an external attacker targeting a provider you do not control. The vulnerability is the organization's dependency on the provider's security controls to protect your client's data. The impact is regulatory exposure under the applicable data protection regulations, reputational harm to the organization's client relationships, and potential contractual liability. Now the treatment options become concrete. Avoidance would mean not proceeding with the contract, which leadership has taken off the table as a business decision. Mitigation takes several forms. Data minimization, sending only the data fields the SaaS provider actually needs to fulfill the service, not everything in your database. Contractual controls, a data processing agreement that specifies the provider's security obligations, their breach notification timeline, their data retention and deletion requirements, and your right to audit or require third-party audit evidence like SOC 2 reports. Technical controls, ensuring that the data transmitted is encrypted in transit and that the provider maintains encryption at rest. Monitoring, establishing a process to review the provider's audit reports annually and to receive alerts when the provider's security certifications change status. Transfer means ensuring that the organization's cyber insurance policy explicitly covers third-party data processor breaches. Not all policies do. This needs to be confirmed in writing before the contract is signed, not after a breach occurs. Acceptance means acknowledging that after all of the above controls are in place, residual risk remains. A provider who experiences an extremely sophisticated attack, one that bypasses their controls, exploits a zero-day in their infrastructure, and evades their detection, can potentially access your client's data. That risk cannot be reduced to zero. What it can be reduced to is a level that the organization's leadership understands and is willing to carry given the business value of the service. That acceptance needs to be documented with the specific risk level, the controls that were put in place, the rationale for why the residual level is acceptable, the name and title of the approving executive, and the date of the next review. The risk register entry for this scenario does not close when the contract is signed. It lives. It is reviewed quarterly or when the provider issues a security incident notification. It is updated if the data you send to the provider changes in sensitivity, if the provider's ownership or infrastructure changes, or if new vulnerabilities are disclosed that affect their stack. The risk was accepted on specific terms and at a specific point in time. It must be reevaluated as those terms or that context changes. When risk management fails, the troubleshooting dimension. The governance failures that occur around risk management are among the most consequential in security. They tend to be quiet failures, nothing breaks visibly, until the moment when the risk they failed to manage actually materializes. Understanding these failure modes is essential for anyone who will be asked to investigate them or prevent them. The first scenario involves undocumented risk acceptance. A post-incident review reveals that a critical vulnerability in a publicly exposed service was identified 18 months ago, reviewed by a team lead who determined that patching it would require downtime that the business could not schedule and effectively shelved. The team lead had good intentions. They assessed the risk and made a judgment, but they did not document it. They did not get formal sign-off from a risk owner. They did not put a review date on it. They did not flag it to the security program. The vulnerability sat, known and unaddressed, until an attacker found it. When you investigate this kind of governance failure, the goal is not punishment. It is root cause analysis aimed at prevention. What you typically find is one of three things. Either the risk management process was too bureaucratic. The process for formally documenting an acceptance was so cumbersome that practitioners avoided it and made informal decisions instead. Or the process was not well known. The team lead did not understand that informal decisions were not acceptable substitutes for formal risk acceptance. Or the accountability structure was absent. There was no one in the organization whose job it was to ensure that identified risks were tracked and that informal decisions were converted into formal ones. The correction involves all three layers. Simplify the process for low-complexity risk acceptances so that the barrier to formal documentation is low enough to be used. Ensure that everyone who makes decisions about security is trained on the process and understands why documentation is not optional. and assign explicit ownership for risk tracking, a role, whether inside the security team or in GRC, whose function includes chasing down unresolved risk decisions and ensuring they reach appropriate approvers. The second scenario involves the accumulation of policy exceptions. Over the course of a year, an organization receives a rapidly increasing volume of exception requests to its access control policy. Business units cite operational necessity. The process for granting exceptions is well defined, and exceptions are documented, but nobody is reviewing the aggregate pattern. When an analyst reviews the exception log, they find that a third of the organization's most sensitive systems are now operating under active policy exceptions, most of them with no defined expiry date. This is the phenomenon of exception management becoming a shadow policy. The formal policy says one thing. The actual operational practice, defined by the accumulation of exceptions, says something quite different. This is a common finding in organizations where the security policy was designed for an environment that no longer exists, where the constraints it imposes are genuinely incompatible with how the business now operates, and the exceptions are a symptom of that mismatch. The diagnostic process here involves distinguishing between two types of exceptions. The first type is exceptions that exist because the security policy is reasonable, but the specific circumstances of a specific system or process make compliance difficult. These exceptions are appropriate, should have defined expiry dates, and should be reviewed periodically. The second type is exceptions that exist because the policy itself is out of step with the operational reality of the organization. A high concentration of the second type means the policy needs to be revised, not the exceptions managed individually. Revising a policy that has become consistently non-compliant is not weakening security. It is aligning the documented standard with a standard that is actually achievable and enforceable, and building controls around that achievable standard. The third scenario involves risk scores being driven by CVSS without contextualization. A vulnerability management program has been running for 18 months. It reports weekly on the number of critical, high, medium, and low vulnerabilities across the environment. The board receives these metrics and uses them to assess the security team's effectiveness. But the metrics are based on raw CVSS scores without environmental context. A critical CVSS vulnerability on an air-gapped test server with no external connectivity is being counted the same as a critical CVSS vulnerability on the production API gateway that handles customer transactions. The team is prioritizing based on numerical score alone, working through the list from the top, and the business-critical systems are not necessarily being addressed first. Diagnosing this requires introducing asset criticality into the prioritization calculation. The risk level of a vulnerability is not its CVSS score. It is its CVSS score weighted by the criticality of the asset it affects, the exploitability given the actual network exposure, the presence or absence of compensating controls, and whether active exploitation in the wild has been observed. When this contextualized view is applied, the priority list often looks dramatically different from the CVSS-only list. Critical vulnerabilities on low-value, isolated systems may drop to the middle of the queue. Medium vulnerabilities on critical, exposed systems may rise to the top. This is not lowering standards. It is applying intelligence to the remediation effort rather than mechanical processing of a numerical ranking. The role-specific experience of risk management. A security architect designing a zero-trust network access rollout encounters the risk management principle at the design stage in a very particular way. The mandate is to eliminate implicit trust, to ensure that every access request, regardless of origin, is evaluated against policy before being permitted. The architectural principle is sound, but the architect knows that enforcing it universally on day one will break things. Service accounts that were never designed to authenticate to an identity provider. Legacy applications that assume network locality equals trust. Machine identities that have no certificate, no token, and no credential management discipline. The risk of enforcing zero trust too quickly is operational disruption that erodes confidence in the program and generates exemptions that undermine the architecture before it is fully established. The architect's risk management decision here is a phased implementation with monitoring mode preceding enforcement mode. In monitoring mode, the identity-aware proxy observes all access requests and logs what would have been denied under enforcement. This phase has a duration, typically 90 days, during which the access patterns are mapped, the service account inventory is built, the legacy applications are cataloged, and the policy exceptions that are legitimate are identified and documented. Only when that map is reasonably complete does enforcement begin, starting with the highest risk, highest visibility applications. The risk of a phased approach is that the protection benefit is delayed. The architect documents this explicitly. For the duration of the monitoring phase, access control for these systems relies on existing network perimeter controls. The residual risk of this approach is accepted until enforcement is enabled, with a target date of specific date. That is a risk acceptance. It is documented, owned, and time-limited. A security analyst at an MSSP encounters the risk management principle in a different register entirely. Their job is to help customers understand the relationship between what the monitoring service observes and the risk levels those observations represent. When a new threat intelligence report indicates that a specific apt group is actively targeting organizations in the financial sector using SSH-based initial access techniques, the analyst must translate that information into an action for customers in that sector. The question is not just, does this threat exist? The question is, what is the risk to this specific customer given their exposure? Some customers have SSH accessible from the internet. Some have it locked down to specific management subnets. Some have alert rules for SSH anomalies. Some do not. The analyst's communication to each customer should be differentiated based on that assessment. A customer with SSH locked to a management subnet and monitoring in place receives an informational briefing. A customer with SSH broadly accessible and no anomaly detection receives an urgent recommendation to restrict exposure immediately and a set of detection signatures to deploy. The same threat information, contextualized differently against different risk profiles, produces different treatment recommendations. This is what risk management looks like in an operational security service. The intelligence has no value without the contextualization. A compliance and audit professional encounters the principle during the post-mortem of a governance failure. Their role is not to build the controls, but to verify that the risk decisions made by the organization are being made with appropriate rigor and accountability. When an audit reveals that 30% of users have accumulated excessive permissions over time despite a written access control policy, the audit finding is not simply access control is non-compliant. The finding is a risk management failure at multiple layers. The joiner-mover-lever process failed to revoke old permissions when employees changed roles. The access review process, if it existed at all, was not functioning. The risk register did not include an entry for privilege creep as an ongoing risk, and no one was accountable for ensuring that the aggregate state of access permissions remained consistent with the policy. The audit recommendation is not just to fix the current permissions, though that is necessary. It is to implement the governance structures that prevent the problem from recurring, quarterly access reviews with named owners, automated deprovisioning triggers when an HR system role change is processed, and a risk register entry for access creep that is reviewed at each audit cycle. The compliance professional is using the risk management framework to design accountability structures that outlast the current incident. Case scenario: a hospital, an AI tool, and a board that needs to decide. The scenario opens at a hospital board meeting. The clinical team is presenting a compelling case for adopting a new AI-powered diagnostic tool. The tool analyzes patient imaging data and provides preliminary assessments that have been shown in peer-reviewed research to improve diagnostic accuracy in certain categories of condition by a statistically significant margin. The projected impact over 12 months is substantial in terms of patient outcomes. The constraint is significant. The tool is cloud-hosted. The vendor's model requires that patient imaging data be transmitted to and processed on the vendor's infrastructure. The hospital's data protection officer has reviewed the arrangement and flagged it as high risk under applicable healthcare privacy regulations. The legal team has reviewed the vendor contract and identified several areas where liability in the event of a breach is insufficiently addressed. The security architect has assessed the vendor's publicly available compliance posture and found that while they hold a relevant certification, its scope and depth cannot be fully verified from the outside. The security team is asked to produce a risk treatment recommendation that allows the board to make a decision with adequate information. The first step is to be precise about the risks. There are two primary scenarios. The first is a direct breach of the vendor's infrastructure resulting in exfiltration of patient imaging data. The second is a contractual and regulatory scenario in which the hospital is found to have failed its obligations to patients by engaging a vendor whose security posture does not meet the applicable standard of care. These scenarios are related but distinct and require different treatment strategies. For the first scenario, mitigation is available at several levels. De-identification of data before transmission reduces the sensitivity of what the vendor holds. Under the applicable data protection framework, imaging data from which the patient cannot be identified carries different regulatory weight than fully identified records. The clinical team confirms that the AI tool can process de-identified data with no reduction in diagnostic utility for the specific use cases being evaluated. This is not universal. Some AI diagnostic tools require full context, but in this case it is confirmed. This single mitigation step reduces the regulatory exposure of a breach significantly, because the data that would be exfiltrated is no longer directly linked to identifiable patients. A business associate agreement, required under the applicable healthcare privacy regulation, is negotiated with the vendor to establish explicit contractual obligations regarding security controls, breach notification timelines, data retention, and deletion requirements. The right to request the vendor's most recent SOC 2 audit report as part of the annual review is included. Transfer is addressed by confirming with the hospital's insurer that the cyber insurance policy covers third-party processor breaches involving de-identified healthcare data, and obtaining that confirmation in writing. The second scenario, regulatory and contractual liability, requires a different treatment. The hospital's legal counsel reviews the applicable standards and concludes that engaging a cloud vendor with a current relevant certification, with a signed business associate agreement, with a data minimization approach that de-identifies data before transmission, and with insurance coverage in place, represents a defensible level of due care. A memorandum documenting this assessment is produced and retained. This memo is the governance instrument. If a regulatory inquiry ever occurs, the hospital can demonstrate that it evaluated the arrangement, applied professional judgment, implemented controls, and obtained legal opinion on its obligations. That is not a guarantee against regulatory consequences, but it is evidence of good faith and professional conduct. What cannot be treated is the residual risk that the vendor's infrastructure could be breached by an extremely sophisticated attacker using methods that bypass their controls, and that de-identification might not fully protect patients if an attacker combined the stolen imaging data with other publicly available datasets. This is the residual risk that the board must formally accept. The security team's recommendation is that this risk be accepted on specific terms. The board votes on the decision, and the vote is minuted. The risk acceptance is added to the risk register with a named owner in the executive team. The board reviews the arrangement annually, and any change in the vendor's certification status, ownership, or security incident history triggers an immediate out-of-band review. The board votes to proceed. The tool is deployed. 12 months later, the clinical team reports improved diagnostic outcomes. The risk register entry for the vendor relationship is reviewed at the annual cycle. The vendor's SOC 2 report has been updated and reviewed by the security team. No new concerns have emerged. The residual risk acceptance is renewed for another year with the same terms. This is risk management in practice, not the elimination of uncertainty, not the pretense that the arrangement is risk-free, but the deliberate, documented management of a real risk in a way that allows the organization to pursue a genuine benefit while maintaining accountability for the exposure it is carrying. The compliance trap, when management becomes theater. There is a failure mode that is worth naming explicitly, because it is common, and because it is particularly insidious in organizations that are trying to do the right thing. It is the mistake of treating compliance as a proxy for security, or treating the documentation of risk management as a substitute for the actual management of risk. Compliance frameworks, whether payment card standards, healthcare privacy regulations, general data protection frameworks, or sector-specific requirements, define a floor. They specify a minimum set of controls and practices that organizations operating in a regulated space must implement. They are valuable because they establish a baseline that every organization in that space must meet, which reduces the worst-case scenarios of total neglect. But they are not a ceiling. They are not a complete risk management program. And the organization that achieves compliance and stops there has not built security. It has built a compliance posture. The gap between compliance and security is often where the most damaging breaches occur. An organization can be fully compliant with a framework as of its most recent audit and still have significant vulnerabilities that the framework does not address. The framework was written at a point in time, reflects a consensus about baseline practices as of that time, and is updated on a cycle that does not track the speed of the threat landscape. An adversary who knows your framework controls and attacks in the spaces they do not cover is not attacking your security. They are attacking your compliance gap. The correct posture is to treat compliance requirements as a starting point and to layer an actual risk management program on top of them. The risk register should contain entries that correspond to compliance requirements, and should also contain entries for risks that are real but not addressed by any framework you are subject to. The controls you implement should satisfy compliance requirements, and should also address the risks specific to your environment, your assets, and your threat model that no framework anticipated. The governance structures you build should demonstrate compliance to auditors, and should also produce the accountability and discipline that actually reduces your exposure. An auditor verifying last year's controls is not securing your future. They are providing evidence about a moment in time. Security is not a moment. It is a continuous state of active management, and the organizations that treat it as such are the ones that remain resilient as the threat landscape changes around them. Closing, the discipline of carrying uncertainty well. There is a posture that separates the security professionals who genuinely lead from the ones who merely manage. It is not a technical skill. It is a disposition toward uncertainty. The security professional who understands that risk is inevitable does not waste energy pursuing the fiction of total protection. They invest that energy in becoming precise about what they are protecting, honest about what they cannot fully protect, rigorous about the decisions they make around the gap, and disciplined about keeping those decisions current as the world changes. Every asset you protect today is subject to a threat you did not anticipate. Every control you deployed last year is decaying against a threat environment that is evolving. Every risk acceptance you documented 6 months ago was right for the conditions that existed then, and those conditions may have already changed. The register needs to be alive. The appetite needs to be revisited. The treatments need to be validated. The assumptions that underpin every decision need to be interrogated periodically by someone whose job is to say, "Is this still true?" This is not a comfortable way to practice security. It would be far more comfortable to believe that a certain budget, a certain set of tools, a certain compliance certification represents a state of safety that can be maintained with routine effort. But that belief is precisely what makes organizations vulnerable, not to sophisticated attackers, but to ordinary ones who simply walk through the door that the organization believed was locked because they stopped checking. Manage the risk. Document the choices, own the residual, review the assumptions. That is the work. It was never anything else. End of session mental model. Risk is inevitable. Manage it, don't eliminate it.